Well, let's take you back live to the Bellwether Economist Conference in Sydney, and the issue of innovation and regulation in the markets being discussed now.
The Executive General Manager for the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Australia. Next to him, Martin Fahy, the Asia-Pacific Practice Leader for the Hackett Group, a strategic advisory firm, and on the end, Brian Johnson, Analyst with CLSA. Now, there's a sort of, financial innovation in some parts of the world is a terrible word at the moment. You get this immediate sort of recoil from people, a revulsion, held responsible for what went on. In some ways that's slightly sterile, and presumably innovation can be good or bad. It just depends on how it's used. So I just want to start with a perspective from each of you on the amount of innovation that you see in the Australian financial services landscape, and depending on how much there is, whether you think it's sort of good or bad, if it's too subdued, too creative, etc. So perhaps we'll move from Jeremy across the line and then get into some debate. So Jeremy, would you like to comment on that first?
Sure, Andrew. We didn't get as badly bitten as the rest of the world with financial innovation, which is obviously a good thing. There's probably not enough. There are many challenges we've got that are going to call for financial innovation in the retirement area. Just recently, the issue of how much risk there is in the superannuation system has come to the fore. We've got a clear longevity issue in Australia that's going to need a considerable amount of financial innovation to bring it about. So there are a lot of challenging and positive stories there. Aged care, our superannuation funds are going to have to get experienced in being direct providers of debt on a very large scale. So lots of challenges, and let's hope people are enthusiastic about meeting them.
Okay, terrific. We'll come back to those in a second, but Lee, initial thoughts?
Thank you, Andrew. A couple of fairly basic statements, but important at these opening remarks. Good capital markets are essential for strong economies, and if you get the right settings, you will get the efficiency of the markets and the low transaction costs. And if we think about innovation, we are really focused on trying to make sure that we get the right types of outcomes. Those outcomes really are efficiency, and in a sense, if the right permutations, it leads to a general sense of societal well-being and happiness. So in terms of Australia at the moment, Jeremy remarked that we did pretty well through the economic crisis, so that's good settings for us. But that's probably because we are generally more of a culture of followers than perhaps innovators. And, in the financial sector, that's probably where we sit at the moment. So in terms of whether it's good or bad, I'd put that to you for some further discussion. Let's think about what the right innovations might actually be. Because as you said, if you hear that phrase at the moment, there's a bit of drawing a breath and people being, oh no, that's not where we want to be. But in reality, innovation is what it is. It's what people actually do, and for what reasons they might do things is actually more richness in the discussion, I think.
Yeah. Martin?
I think when we talk about innovation, we have a habit to focus in on product innovation, and particularly capital markets products. And the challenge there is that the innovation is observable, it's replicable, and the comparative advantage periods are very short because you can copy. I think we need to move away from purely seeing it as one category of innovation. There's product innovation, I think there's process innovation, and there's business model innovation. I think the challenge we have generally in Australia is the oligopolistic structure of many of the markets. Not just financial services, means that the paranoia that you need to drive competitors' creative destruction is absent. So the burning platform for innovation becomes, the dying embers there. So Jeremy talked in his review about the fact that we still cut checks to transfer superannuation from one end of the town to the other. This morning I noticed in the media the cost of the government's stimulus package of $900 where people got sent a cheque. So one of the biggest direct stimulus to the economy, and we sent out a cheque. And I think the challenge we have is that we put innovation in one bucket. I think we need to deconstruct it. If we're going to look at innovation, I think there's enough focus, as Hector Sands said, on socially useless innovation, of the product type, but there are some real challenges. And for me, it's about the productivity of the industry and in particular process innovation. Process innovation within the industry. When are we going to see in financial services a Toyota that makes 200 more cars per shift than a General Motors? We see Rio Tinto using remote control dump trucks 600-700 kilometres from the mining site, driven from control centres in Perth. I don't think we see the process innovation, and I think we need to start to focus on that. But ultimately, unless we start addressing structural issues from a competition point of view, then why bother innovating?
Brian, to you on that in particular, I mean, what Martin's describing is a trade-off between stability and competition that worked well for Australia in the crisis.
I have a big problem with all these things, Andrew, because I always come along and I always look like the grumpiest bloke in the world. But if you have a look at Australia, the really big problem is that, I keep on hearing that Australia sailed through everything beautifully, but I'm not sure whether people are aware of it, but we just had 15 years of system credit growth growing at 1.8 times nominal GDP. So, for all the talk of innovation, really what happened in Australia was financial services companies just geared the bejesus out of every asset, and a lot of that debt has now ended up in households. Now, in an environment where leverage is going up, it's incredibly easy to generate revenues, and there's lots of transactions, lots of volatility, so everything's absolutely fantastic. The problem is the new world that we're heading into is you've got to unwind that 15 years of excess, and I would suggest to you most innovation is going to be pretty simple. It's working out how to deal with an environment where revenue opportunities slow, and it's all going to be basically about cutting costs. Now, if you have a look at the things I look at, the Australian banks, the IT, the fundamental IT platforms, one of the banks recently acknowledged to me that they've been sweating the assets for years, which is why we read more and more about them falling over all the time. But it's been a fantastic time to be in financial services because it was all so easy. It gets somewhat more challenging now, but I'd point out that the two big innovation trends for me going forward is somehow working out how to unwind this massive leverage that we see everywhere in the system, and the other one is how do I basically provide financial services using technology? How do I finally liberate these economies of technology? And I think it'll take a bit of time to work through the system.
I mean, you describe leverage-driven growth, which we saw in the US, but in the US, on top of that, you had lots of debt, but then at the point where it became difficult for borrowers to access credit, you had innovation on top to create all these products, option arms, etc., to pick a pay, to enable people to go the extra mile and leverage up even more.
I think in Australia we were somewhat lucky because there's a paucity of funding for the Australian banks, and there weren't a lot of retail deposits, and because lending margins were so wide and so lucrative. You didn't need to invest in some of the more rubbishy type securities globally to get great returns. All you needed to do was really just invest a little bit more in a domestic home loan. You got a great return on equity. So I think it's fortuitous that we avoided some of the massive extremes of really stupid leverage. But anyone that doesn't think that 15 years, 1.8 times nominal GDP doesn't equal a dramatically, a much more leveraged society is incorrect, and that's basically what we're seeing now. If you have a look, I always love investing because to me it really is about just reading the newspaper, looking on the front page of the Telegraph, and it doesn't head into the financial press for weeks later. I don't know if anyone watched The Block the other night. The very clear message there was house prices aren't going up anymore, perhaps they're falling.
Yeah, Martin.
I think going to his point about the technology issue, because banks are seen as playing such a critical role in the payments infrastructure, one of the things they've been able to do for prudential regulatory reasons, but also for wider reasons given the RBA's oversight of payments, is they've been able to escape again that creative destruction that we've seen undermined big telco, it's undermined the publishing industry, it's undermined the media. And as long as we have this nervousness around letting new players into the payment space, and then letting new players into perhaps peer-to-peer banking, peer-to-peer lending, etc., it's unlikely that we'll see the breakthroughs that we saw in moving from old telco to voice over IP, in terms of moving from the established technology, large mini mainframe players to the PC environment. Those breakthroughs that we saw in productivity, price performance are unlikely to feed through, primarily because of concerns around stability of the payments. And I think that's preventing the sort of destructive creativity that we might need to get the breakthroughs.
Although, I mean, that's a legitimate sort of trade-off to think about, isn't it? I mean, you know, creative destruction in terms of the financial services industry is much more difficult than it is with, you know, other types of products and services.
I think there'll be less tolerance of it as we go forward. This room is full of people who walked into music shops and flicked through vinyl. Okay? And soon you're not going to be able to walk into a bookshop and flick through the books. I think the real breakthrough will be a generation of people who can't understand why you need to go to a bank branch to conduct banking operations, and there'll be very, very limited tolerance for this heavy footprint and much more expectation around what they can transact online and their established proprietary technologies and networks, etc.
Although I mean, again, we sort of come back to some of the debates which are playing out in other parts of the world. But you know, bank branches, okay, some things you can transact online. You could argue, to your point about process innovation, that in some parts of the world, like the States, the fact that the process of applying for a mortgage was automated, that it was moving away from the traditional kind of handshake-based relationship was the problem. I mean, there is a flip side to the more efficient world that you describe.
I think you have to be careful not to sort of put the blame for low-doc subprime mortgages on the scoring systems. Ultimately, it was a reflection of a business model that was driven by policy decisions within the Clinton regime that wanted to increase home ownership. So I think we have to be careful on that. I do understand that there are elements of the payment systems that need to be guarded. But I think the challenge is that there's a real argument out there that we've got large technology players who I think we need to start to recognise the contribution they can make to process efficiency.
Okay, so
and just on that as well, I mean, when I speak to my children, and my children are much smarter than me, if I ask them, who would you rather transact with, do you think they'll choose Westpac or Sony? And Sony is opening up a bank in Australia. I mean, Google, it's a terrifying company because of how it can basically penetrate young people's thinking, and it's changing. If you go back in the 1920s from memory, one of my favourite stories is from memory, one of the biggest components of the Dow Jones was a rubber stamp manufacturer. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, if you go back to that Bill Clinton speech in 1998 from memory, when he said how everyone in the US should be entitled to have a loan, and I'm going to change the rules so that everyone can get a loan, it didn't take that long to totally destroy the system. 10 years is pretty amazing, and the velocity of everything is accelerating dramatically.
Yeah. There was a George W. Bush said in 2004, every new person into an American home makes the American economy stronger. So that didn't work out too well. But on your point about Google, I mean, do you think firms like that want to become banks? You know, there's a tremendous sort of regulatory apparatus that you now have to grapple with. What's the incentive for a Google to become a bank?
I don't pretend to be an expert on technology, but it really does strike me that, you know, going back to when you go to transact through a bank branch, it's not a particularly pleasant experience. Whereas transacting online is pretty easy, very quick, incredibly convenient. If you have a look at Google, I think it's an amazing stock. I think people for a long time thought Google's sole mission in life was just to digitise every piece of information in the world. We all think Facebook. Go on Google Plus and have a look at how they're penetrating. Google's mission is pretty simple. It's to make a bucket load of every dynamic. And financial services, I feel confident in saying, will be there.
On the distinction that Martin made between product innovation and process innovation, and to Jeremy, I mean, the sort of challenge is why hasn't the industry seen a Toyota, you know, that kind of equivalent breakthrough in process efficiency and business model? Why do you think that is?
Generally, these things are about incentives. So, what would be the point in doing that? And if I can add to Martin's two ideas, really the missing one in discussion so far is the top-down one. So, the proposition that innovation is actually about big ideas. Sure, there are efficient technologies and things that can happen, but Where you get real financial innovation is where you get a big idea, like take superannuation. You know, the idea of compelling all of the workers in an economy to put money aside for the future is a pretty big idea, and that's where we're seeing things play out at the moment, that there perhaps hasn't been enough financial innovation in that space, both in the accumulation area. We're now seeing when you set up a system where you send account statements out to the whole population every 6 months with the sort of volatility we've been having, that causes problems. And we haven't innovated our decumulation space yet. So I guess I'm most interested in the big picture, top-down kind of innovations that we need to make in this country.
And can you sort of flesh that out for us a little bit? I mean, what kinds of things would address both that accumulation and decumulation?
Well, ultimately it all just comes down to a collection of risks that I think we have perhaps over-enthusiastically placed at the feet of our population. So that's the sort of volatility in accumulation. I think we're getting some negative feedback about that at the moment. But in retirement, it's a whole bunch of new risks that not everyone understands. This risk of longevity, so the fact that you most likely outlive your savings. The spectre of inflation in retirement, where you're not connected to a wage. Wages generally look after you in the sense that they go up with the right. In retirement, that's a real difficulty to manage. And then volatility in retirement is more dramatic than it is in accumulation. So all of those risks that need financial innovation to deal with them.
Is there a longevity swaps kind of market or need for that here? I guess that's more of a defined benefit.
It is much more of a defined benefit kind of environment, yes.
Okay. And Lee, the same question to you, if I may.
Yeah, look, a couple of points there. I think the first is that when we talk about the innovation, you know, it has to be for the right reasons. So we heard the comment about every American being able to own a home at a particular point. So if you hold that idea, you then say, well, how does this translate down to individuals? And where it seems to happen then is you get, I think I heard Jeremy say, some skewed incentives, but that's really where you get the individual or the organisation taking the overall goal of innovation for the right reasons, but somehow it translates into poorer practices or downright fraud in a way. So we've got to make sure that when we talk about innovation, we're talking about what I would call value creation or general happiness for society, not for any other reasons that are a bit skewed. The Australian psyche, I would put to you, is one that is a little hard to change, so therefore innovation sort of is contrary to that. You know, we're people who are generally contented, and therefore at times contentment doesn't lead to a lot of innovation in a way. I think the challenge for us then, coming from where we've gone and what's happening in the globe at the moment, is to make sure we get the right level still of regulation around innovative practices. And I think that's probably something we want to cover a little bit further, but gee, poor regulation can kill innovation outright, and that can just be down to, you know, too much red tape or whatever you like to call it. But the right settings can actually really allow it to flourish and bloom.
I definitely want to come back to the regulatory point, but just does that resonate with everyone, the idea of on the demand side, the sort of culturally conservative, contented Australian who doesn't particularly demand new products or processes?
The evidence on our gambling statistics is slightly worrying. We gamble more than North Americans per capita. For my mind, one of the features, and that's, to me, comes through in our superannuation. So if we project ourselves forward with 9% going to 12%, compounding, growth in population, we have this enormous pool of superannuation savings. Some of it sits in retail, some will sit in self-managed super, and some in industry funds. And we've got three competing models, if you like. So the industry's funds are interesting as a business model. Will they innovate? So we'll have 5 or 6 industry funds, CBUS, UniSuper, about the size that CalPERS are at currently in 2025. What will innovation look like there? If they're serious about innovation, it won't be financial services innovation, it'll be healthcare. Inflation will be their primary target. because the primary risk for industry super funds will be post-retirement healthcare inflation. If they're going to innovate to protect their members under their business model, that's where they'd be directing attention. Looking at how they'll manage inflation, spiralling inflation in healthcare of maybe 11-12%. On the other hand, we'll have a whole load of Australians with self-managed super with $250,000 balances, much more than they have net, and they'll be looking to do innovative things. And what will innovation in financial planning look like? And I think that's where people like Jeremy are starting to think long-term about innovation in the wealth management space and what it might look like.
Jeremy, do you want to